applauding you guys. You're the ones that are doing the hard work. Thank you so much. Taking time out of your schedule to be here today. This is the warm-up for next year. Because next year is going to be critical. And you know, for so long, most people were like folks here in East Texas, you know, basically we're saying, just, you know, government, leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and that's the way we like it. In fact, it reminded me of a story a judge here told me some years back about he was down in Austin at a seminar, and he was staying at a particular motel because he liked their free breakfast better than everybody else's there. And so he was at the free breakfast the next morning, and there was a bus from the First Baptist Church of Crockett, Texas, some of the seniors from Crockett, and they were there, and he said about half of them were in the line in front of me. And he said, but there was one guy in front of me that had 2 plates, and he couldn't believe he had 2 plates, and they were both full, and he's standing there still in line. And so a guy in front of him turned around, and obviously they knew each other, and he said, don't you know eating like that will kill you? And the other fellow said, with the plate, said, I'll have you know my grandfather lived to be 95 years of age. He said, your grandfather lived to 95 eating like that? He said, no, he did it by minding his own business. You know, and that's what people want. You know, you leave us alone, you know, we'll mind our own business. But what they have found is that government did exactly what Thomas Jefferson said, that the normal course of things is for government to gain and liberty to yield. And that's the battle that's been going on. And that battle has actually been getting lost for a while. The Tea Party folks have made a difference. They've changed the discussion in Washington. Absolutely have. Could you imagine 3 years ago that the debate over the budget in 2011 would not be how much money to throw at this or that, but how much to cut? You've made that difference. But now's not the time to start. Because there's too many people in Washington that are thinking, gee, maybe the Tea Party folks, you know, the crowds aren't quite as big as they were originally. Maybe they're not going to be as energetic next year during the election. Maybe we don't have to pay as much attention to them. You got to disavow them of that. You got to keep letting every elected official know. You've got 2 senators from Texas. I appreciate hearing from you. So I come home on weekends. It makes me a better congressman to hear from you. I don't know about other districts, but I know in East Texas, even if it's 2 a.m. in Walmart when I'm running to get something, because that's the only time I was able to, people will walk right up to you and tell you what they think. You know? And in fact, one guy had seen me in the grocery store at Butcher's and said, wow, you really don't have a security detail. And I said, no, it's just you, me, and the syrup here. But I don't think I need it here in East Texas. But this nation needs to know that you still care. And you're not going to let them get away with what's been going on. Well, now, you would have thought, and this is a good example why you can't quit, you would have thought that after the biggest political gain in election since the 1930s, that the new party that took charge in the House of Representatives would have the message. And yet, after November, we had a lame duck session, and it was like our folks, our leadership, went to sleep. Oh, we'll worry about that next year. And most people agree, for the Democrats, who had just gotten a thrashing in the election, they had the most productive lame duck session in American history. They shouldn't have been able to get away with that. But our folks were saying, yeah, but we still don't have enough people, and we don't have the majority yet. They knew we were about to take the majority. One of my friends, Republican from Michigan, Thad said for our folks to say, gee, we better rush and cut a deal with them now during the lame duck session before all the new Republican congressmen come would be like Custer saying, we better attack those Indians now before our own reinforcements get here. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And yet, we yielded and yielded. And back in September, I didn't have anything to do with putting the Republican pledge together. But I took the pledge. Yes, I will support that pledge. We haven't been keeping the pledge quite like we said. And it's important to keep reminding people of the pledge they took. Well, I've been keeping it, but there's a big group of us there. And so what was amazing to me, you go back and read the pledge. The pledge says, with common sense exceptions for seniors, veterans, and our troops, we will roll back government spending to pre-stimulus, pre-bailout levels, saving us at least $100 billion in the first year alone. Folks, if you go back to pre-stimulus, pre-bailout levels, that's 2007. You remember January of 2008 is when the president I like so much, he's a good man, but he got talked into a so-called stimulus of $160 billion, $40 billion of which was going to be rebates to people that didn't pay any tax. And some of you remember, I didn't know the mic was live on the floor of the House when President Bush came by me, and I said, by the way, Mr. President, how do you give a rebate to people that didn't put any bait in? And there's not an answer to that because it's not a rebate. You got to pay some tax to get some of your tax money back. And that's why I voted against it then. They tell us there are 17 members of Congress and the Senate, 17 total, that have voted against each one of those stimuluses, stimuli, and bailouts. They were not a good idea. And as I told the president, leaders of our parties in September and October of 2008, when they wanted to bail out Wall Street, which, by the way, donates Democrats to Democrats 4-1 over Republicans. Did you know that? We get beat up for having all the ties to Wall Street. They donated to Obama 4 times more than they donated to McCain. You need to know that. So when you keep wondering how in the world is the Democratic government continuing to let Wall Street engorge themselves, I thought they were for the little guy. Well, go look and check the records. 4-1 over Republicans. It ought to tell you what you need to know. It's been tough dealing with a president who puts a moratorium on drilling off our Gulf Coast. Boy, Mike Church knows something about that. He said he was going to create or save jobs. Well, he can't produce the jobs that were created, so anybody that still has a job, the president wants you to know he saved it for you. Okay? Well, the truth is, just as Chuck Colson says, our hope will not arrive on Air Force One. And people need to understand and get that. It won't arrive on Air Force One. Our hope is in the same place that the founders had. Now, I was taught Ben Franklin was a deist. He believed, supposedly I was taught, that some deity created everything and then steps back, and even if that deity still exists, never gets involved in the things of nature or man. People are on their own. That's what a deist thinks in a nutshell. And yet you go back when Franklin was 80 years old, look at his words, read his words. He had trouble getting into the Independence Hall. He had to have help. He had gout. He had a lot of problems. He was a couple of years so away from meeting his maker. And if he had ever been a deist, he wasn't after 5 weeks when he stood up and he addressed the crowd trying to come together, but they had been angry and lashing out at each other for 5 weeks. And he went through and in essence said, we've been going for nearly 5 weeks. We've got more no's than ayes on virtually every vote. Then his words were, how has it happened, sir, that we have not once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate understanding? In the beginning contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered. And do we no longer have need of this powerful friend? He goes on a bit and he says, I've lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth. God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it possible an empire could rise without his aid? We've been assured, sir, in the sacred writing, that unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Then he said, firmly believe this. He went on and said, I also firmly believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in our political building no better than the builders of Babel. Somebody's hurt. Prayers are always a help. He said, without his concurring aid, we'll succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We'll be divided by our local partial interests, and we ourselves shall become a byword down through the ages. That's not a deist. And in fact, what a lot of people don't know is that he urged that they begin each day with prayer, like they had done back before. And then a guy named James Madison that knows something about the Constitution, he's given more credit with it than writing it than most. He made an informal motion. It was seconded by Mr. Sherman, unanimously adopted. And from that day in 1787 until yesterday when we were in session, we began with prayer. Every day. Imagine, with that kind of history, there's no way a Supreme Court could ever say that Constitution that came about because of prayer prohibits prayer in public settings. Nobody would be that stupid or that ignorant of our history, you wouldn't think. But it didn't stop there. Edmund Jennings Randolph from Virginia stood up and he says, he made a motion on top of Franklin's and said that a sermon be preached at the request of the convention on July 4th, the anniversary of independence, and thenceforward prayers be used in ye convention every morning. So that was Randolph adding to the one that had already been made. They agreed to that. Every one of those delegates to the Constitutional Convention went to church together in the Reformed Calvinistic Church and heard a sermon. And Jonathan Dayton wrote, when they reassembled, he said, we assembled again and every unfriendly feeling had been expelled and a spirit of conciliation had been cultivated. That's how we got here. It took activism by people that cared to give us the greatest country in the history of mankind. And just like any of you that have ever worked on a farm or ranch knows, if you've got a really good piece of farm equipment and you don't do anything to maintain it, you're going to lose it. You have got to work with that piece. You've got to use it. You've got to go through, lubricate, make sure that it gets used and it gets maintained. And so for too long, too many folks before the Tea Party came along just said, look, you take that, Washington, you take care of things, just leave us alone. And they awakened to find that piece of equipment, this little government, did not get maintained properly, and so it isn't working right. It's not doing a smooth job of operating. It's coming through and cutting gashes in the American system that was such a beautiful piece, the greatest government setup ever created. It really was. I thought CR, the continuing resolution, HR 1, it wasn't too bad, but you also need to understand the whole reason we're even dealing with financing the government through the rest of the year is that last year at this time when it should have been done, there were Democrats in the majority, and Speaker Pelosi and Harry Reid decided, this is an election year, we want to spend a lot of money to take care of those who've gotten us where we are, but we don't want to have a budget where everybody can just see everything so easily. Let's don't do a budget. Let's just keep operating and passing bills and just go piecemeal, so they never passed a budget. They didn't do the formal appropriations process for each department. They just kept adding it up piecemeal. And by the end of September of last year, we had spent way over $1 trillion more than we took in. And then we came into this year, and they had a continuing resolution that only lasted to March. Now, I read recently a prayer that Peter Marshall read or gave in the Senate when he was chaplain back in the 1940s. And one of the things Peter Marshall prayed was, Lord, help us to realize that things we call crises, you know to be opportunities. And speaking to my church a moment ago, folks, we have an opportunity. This is an opportunity to get this piece of equipment back working properly. Yeah. That's what has to be done. Well, we got the majority. We let them have a productive lame duck, but we could recover if we kept our pledge and had a good CR. And we even debated, and I was all for it. You know, let's defund Obamacare. There was $105 billion actually appropriated. Normally you don't bind a future Congress, but that bill did. We needed to strip that out. Otherwise, even as I speak to you right now, there's millions and billions of dollars being spent to create the Obamacare apparatus, and once it's fully in place, no matter what the Supreme Court says, it will have driven out so much of the private sector that the government will look around and say, well, I guess we have to do the health care. There's nobody else standing. We can't let that happen. We needed to defund it, and we were told that that would be addressed by my dear friend Denny Rehberg. He had an amendment that we were told would strip out the money. Well, it turns out that's not the case. And what was more troubling was when we heard that our leadership apparently had been told that the Rehberg Amendment, unless it's part of the original bill, cannot rescind a prior appropriation. It's a procedural rule saying it legislates an appropriation bill, which is a violation of the rules. So the only way to do that is to put it in the original bill, because then all points of order are waived and you can't object on the floor to a rescission. That's the only way. Our leadership intentionally left it out of the original CR HR 1, so it cut some of the funding, but we could have rescinded every dime, and we didn't. And then we had a short-term CR that we took up after that, and so it was going a little bit at a time. I didn't want the government to be shut down, but there comes a time when you've got to say, is funding your foreign allies that hate us more important than keeping the government running? Is it? But that's the things we could have done. I was in a conference call, a couple of dear friends, Steve King, Michelle Bachman, and I were talking to Dick Morris last week, and he was. Now, I haven't agreed on Dick with a lot of things, but he said this one is pretty clear. You have separate bills for each department. You pass them, send them down to the Senate like the State Department. Here's your money, but we're not funding all this baloney out there for financial assistance to our enemies. We cut that out. And then it forces the Democratic leadership to come forward and say, no, 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 we're going to shut the government down unless you fund all these little things that you hate, and the people that hate America, we want them funded. Yeah, let them go public and say that. People will see through that. And you can do that with each department and say, okay, here's Health and Human Services, but we're stripping out Obamacare, we're stripping out this, that. Now, you tell the American people you're not going to take care of what you've agreed to just because you want Obamacare funded despite the American people being against it. And let them make that message. But we didn't do that. Instead, we got to the 11th hour, and it had become clear a few weeks ago that if we didn't have a separate bill to ensure our military were paid, if there were a shutdown, the military is essential, and so they have to keep working, but they don't get paid on time. And actually, I originally signed up for infantry, and I enjoyed being a ground pounder and in basic and all that. But Vietnam ended before I graduated. But I know from serving at Fort Benning for 4 years, there's an awful lot of people in the military live paycheck to paycheck. And some of them barely keep the repo man off of their car. And for them to be in Afghanistan or in harm's way and have to worry that they might not get their paycheck, to me, was reprehensible. You know, I believe our party was the party of the moral high ground. But we didn't take our military off the table. It was reprehensible. I'm still continuing to push the bill. We got over 180 co-sponsors in the House. Kay Bailey Hutchinson and Jim Inhofe they took my same language and did it in the Senate. They got 82 co-sponsors. We could take the military's concerns off the table and stand on the issue of cutting spending alone for cutting spending's sake. That's the moral high ground. That's what needs to be done. And some people were amused last week at a Republican Study Committee meeting when people were talking about, do we support this CR, this new one that sounds like it's being negotiated, or do we not support it? And I got up and they brought me the microphone. There's over 100 guys, and I said, well, and those that don't know me well, I get sarcastic sometimes, you know. And I said, well, I guess I'm just one of those folks that feels like if you make a pledge, you ought to keep at least half of a part of it, shouldn't you? So we had said we'd cut spending, restoring it back to pre-stimulus, pre-bailout. Folks, if you go back and look, 2007 was $2.7 trillion. This year's spending is $3.75 trillion. If we're really going to do that, it'd be cutting $1 trillion to keep the pledge, really. But the American people were willing to give us a pass and say, okay, you say you'll cut at least $100 billion. All right, you do that. And then we got to January, and some folks said, you know what? Hey, we don't have a full year. The year ends in September. And I'm thinking, well, we knew that last September when we made the pledge, didn't we? Thought we all knew that. But amazingly, the American people are so understanding and so forgiving. They said, okay, we'll even let you prorate the year, and that means $61 billion to September. And then we come back and say, well, really, it's just as good to do $38.5 billion, isn't it? You know, of the 61 instead of the 100 instead of the trillion. And then we get the CBO report this week that said actually it was 352 million with the M, not with a B. Ouch. Well, I hope that you will continue to stand strong, because there's a lot of fighting still to do. We have got to take and keep a moral high ground in this country. And I'm not just talking about the Republican Party. There's some very moral Democrats, and I've worked with some. And I tell you this, there are some extreme liberals that I disagree with greatly in the Congress, but I can deal with those who are honest and don't lie to me easier than I can deal with pseudo-conservatives that tell you one thing and do another. Well, we have some great freshmen that have come in, and some of them in the last 2 weeks have had their eyes open because they came in thinking that surely no one in the Republican Party would ever lead them into something that wasn't just the right thing to do. They're starting to find, you know what, sometimes our own leadership doesn't exactly lead in the direction they should. We had a mandate last November for the House to cut spending, repeal Obamacare, defund Obamacare, quit taking federal taxpayer dollars out of people's hands who believe with all their heart that abortion is wrong and using them to fund abortion. I mean, that's in Obamacare. I don't care what the president says or anybody else. You go read Obamacare, you see where federal dollars will be able to be used to fund abortions. It's there. We need to have the guts to stand up for what we believe in. And one of the things I learned when I was a judge, working with somebody as special as Judge Cynthia Kent, she was at that end of the courthouse on the second floor. I was at that end of the courthouse on the second floor. And sometimes, you know, you just have to walk down the other end of the hall. She did it to me, I did it to her. Because you can't go calling your buddies and say, what do you think about this? You've got to go along with the law. You've got to go along with what the facts are and make your decision. And then you are in the courtroom. You have to look people in the eye and say, this is the decision. This is what's right under the law and facts. And then suffer the consequences if people think you're wrong. And there are three former district judges in Congress, 2 others with me. And one of them said, have you noticed that we seem to be able to stand up and just call it like it is easier than some folks do? Maybe it's because we couldn't sit there and go, now, I know you don't like that decision. The court reporter made me do that, you know, or the clerk. It's the clerk's fault. You just have to call them like they are. We have some great days ahead, or we could lose this precious experiment in democracy. God has blessed us with the greatest gift of a country any people have ever had. And it is in our hands to keep it going. God has blessed us with that. And Peter Marshall in that prayer said, God, help us to recognize that what we call crises, you see as opportunities. Thank God for this opportunity. We can remold the government. We can redo the committee situation so that we create a welfare committee. So you see the biggest amount of money is over there. And we can do something about it when you see it instead of hiding it. We've got to be about transparency and honesty as God gives us to see the right. As Lincoln said, let us have courage to move on in this fight we're in. Folks, we're in a fight. I'm thankful you're willing to be soldiers in the fight. I appreciate your prayers and encouragement. If you keep it up, God will continue to bless America. And our greater days can still be ahead. And God bless you for doing that. Thank you so much.